So let me give you a real quick rundown of what this is about. So this is the organization that we had spoken about before. It's CAN. And they're essentially launching this new platform, and they sent me a bunch of questions. They wanted me to have a conversation with a climate scientist, and actually, I could not think of anybody better at Woodwell than you in reality, because of your position and the fact that you are like a master communicator and a scientist. And so I just think that this is really fortuitous, actually, because the whole point of this project is trying to really hone in on the communication aspect of climate change in relationship to, like, how do we take art? How do we take something that's typically very abstract, and is about world building, right? Making art is about building another world, as opposed to science, which is really about understanding our world, right? And how do we communicate these things, right? So anyway, the list of the questions was, we should talk about ourselves, and how do you know about CAN? And then I'll explain that later. And then what was the first time art inspired you? And then what are your views on climate change, and what are you doing towards it? And then the last one is probably the most important one, the one we should spend the most amount of time on, is, do you believe that art can inform or influence the impact of the work you are doing? And if so, how? And if not, why? And actually, I think that's really the most important thing for you and I to discuss in the relationship of, like, the relationship that we have, you and I have, with me as you're the artist in residence at Woodwell Climate Research Center, for the people that are going to be listening into this. We can start and dig in anywhere you want. Why don't you just say a little bit about yourself, about your background, and before you came to Woodwell, and now what you do at Woodwell. Let me start there.
Yeah, so I'm Heather Goldstone, and I'm the Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate Research Center. And I have this kind of winding background. I'm not actually a climate scientist. I did start my career as a scientist, but I was actually in molecular biology. I was interested in environmental questions, but wasn't working on climate change. I was working on pollution issues, actually.
So environmental issues.
Environmental issues, looking at pollution in the ocean and how that affects fish. But as I was doing that research, which I thought and had thought since I was 12 years old was going to be my calling in life, I realized that I was not in the right place, which was a really hard realization, actually. It felt like a big jump, but it actually took me 4 years. So I guess it was more of a wading in than a diving in process, to switch to radio journalism and radio storytelling, still about science. And climate change became my sole focus for a couple of years, and then a main theme in my work for a long time. And then it was about 1.5 years ago that I decided it was really time for me to re-engage with the climate change issue full time. As I said, I'd been reporting on it. It was probably about 1/4 of what I did in the years before that, but I really felt like I needed to do it full time. And that was in part being driven by something that I know sounds like a complete cliche, which is my 3 children and the need to be able to look them and myself via the mirror in the eye and feel like I was really doing everything that I could to combat this existential threat to all of our futures, and for me personally, to my kids' futures. So along the way, I would say I've come to really love and appreciate communication. I think when I first got into it, I was just thinking, okay, I love science and I just want to share science with a broader audience, and that's still true. But I gained this appreciation of storytelling as both an art and a science, and a lens for not only reflecting what we see in the world, but making meaning of what we see in the world. So I would say over the years, I've gone from being very much in the sciences to being this person who feels like I have feet in different worlds, or kind of straddle different worlds a lot of the time.
That's great. And can you just explain a little bit more about your current role at Woodwell?
Yeah, so as Chief Communications Officer at Woodwell Climate, again, I have my fingers in a number of different pots, but broadly speaking, my role is to tell the story of the organization and the work that we do. And that work is really diverse, and it's really challenging to tell the science stories to help people understand what it is we're learning about permafrost in the Arctic, about rainforests in the Amazon and in the Congo, about wetlands in Massachusetts, about grazing fields in Montana and Colorado, right? We work in all of these amazing and different places and study all of these different parts of the climate system. And I think the big overarching story for me there is just that climate change does affect every single place on the planet and every single person on the planet in some way. And it's figuring out how to connect our scientific understanding, kind of figuring out the nuts and bolts of things and telling that, sharing that knowledge in a way that really connects to people's everyday lives, and not only gives them more knowledge, which is obviously a really important first step in addressing climate change, but actually inspires and empowers them to put that knowledge into action and do something with it. And that's something that we do with our work across the board, not only me and my communications work, but all of our partnerships with private sector leaders, our work with Indigenous groups, our work with international policymakers is all about trying to help people really put science into action, not just understand it, but integrate it into what they're doing.
Yeah, so you have a lot of free time on your hands.
Tons.
I mean, this is amazing how and you work with how many scientists now are there at Woodwell?
Yeah, so we've got our primary investigators, kind of the lead scientists. We've got about 24, and then they're of course working with other younger scientists and earlier career stage scientists. So all told, we've got about, I want to say it's about 45 scientists at this point, and the organization as a whole is about 75 people right now.
Wow. Yeah, and I've heard it referred to as like the Delta Force of climate science. So this is not just an average, right? This is not an average group of scientists, right? These are quite remarkable scientists.
Yeah, it is a remarkable group, and I would say what's remarkable, and not to diminish the sheer intellectual power of anyone on our staff, but there are a lot of amazing scientists out there, and I think what really takes our science to the next level and makes us as a small organization able to have such impact is just I can't even think of the right word. Like it's an intensely shared mission. It's not just a shared mission. And if you ask everybody in the organization, we have to stop climate change, and we can't just do science and hope that somebody uses it. We have to help people use it. We have to make sure that it gets used. And it's that shared mission of seeing science integrated and put into action that I think really takes things to the next level. And yeah, I mean, it has to be part of our strategy that we work with other people, because we can't possibly do that for the whole world. So we have to find the people that themselves have the ability to take this further and put the science into action and help other people do that have the ability to amplify it, because we are a relatively small group. So we've sometimes called that influencing the influencers, finding those people who can carry this even further.
So it's
I
like
think it's a really way
so
of working, because
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's like applied science in a way, right? I mean, you're not just creating the science, but then you're trying to figure out how do you apply it, right? And how do you get policymakers and others to pay attention to what what is coming out of all the research and all that's being conducted, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's completely applied science. In fact, our president and executive director, Phil Duffy, says, he loves science, but he's not really interested in science for the sake of science, knowledge for the sake of knowledge. He's interested in what we need to know in order to make the world a better place, and in particular to stop climate change. And so, that infuses our work from the very beginning, that we're not just doing science and then finding somebody as an afterthought that like, oh, well, we want to make sure they know about this work, right? We're working with people thinking, okay, we see a potential problem and we think it might intersect with, these folks over here in the private sector, or these people in this particular part of the world, or these people in a certain part of agriculture. And so we're going to seek them out. We're going to see what they think about it. We're going to figure out what the right questions are to ask and the right way to answer them, so that when we get those answers, they're ready to go into action. So it's absolutely applied science from the beginning. The goal isn't patents or profit or any of that, but it's absolutely applied science.
Yeah. And so what do you think about the having an artist involved in working with scientists, right? I mean, they're almost like diametrically opposed, right? The science and art, right? Because science is about trying to understand our world and the world around us. And meanwhile, art is about trying to create a whole new world, right? It's supposed to be, world making, right? That's what real, art is really supposed to be about. And so these things, I know there's a great quote from Brian Eno, which goes, typically art and science collaborations end in disaster. He says it usually ends with weak science and terrible art. And so, what do you think of having, like, here I am, this artist that's engaging with science and trying to create work that's inspired by science. So what role do you see that having in the world in terms of helping to get the message out and get the ideas and things out into the world from the science that's being conducted at Woodwell?
Well, I'll answer the question in a second, but I have to tell you, I mean, to answer the smallest question of what do I think of having an artist in residence, I think it's amazing and wonderful. And I'm intensely curious whether you share this idea that science and art are diametrically opposed.
I'd say they are quite opposed. I think where they kind of start to come together can be in like data visualization, where we could creatively visualize certain bits of data in science. But in general, I think science can learn a lot from art, and I think art can learn a lot from science. But I think that they kind of operate in their own separate worlds. And I think actually that's a strength as opposed to a weakness, in the sense that I can talk with one of the scientists and learn a tremendous amount about something that I think needs to be reimagined. Art in general, I would say is about, the concept of art is really about binding to the unknowable in a way that transcends reason and being, right? So that's completely antithetical to science, right? And I think that's the power of art in the climate change conversation. And how do we take something that's exceptionally abstract, that's operating on multiple like non-human scales? How do we give that face? How do we give it a body? How do we give it substance and a scale that's relatable to humans? And I think that's the job. That's the job of the arts, and that's the job of the humanities, and it has been for a very long time. So yeah, I do think they are quite opposed to one another. We live in a world that's full of fictitious constructs, and I think that that's emphasized and made it very clear that the role of the artist today is no longer producing more fiction, but maybe to produce tools that help us escape and allow us to find our way back to reality. So I think that's that maybe is the connective tissue back to the science, right? The art helps us reimagine and brings us back to like what the science is trying to tell us. So I don't know. I'm still.
So I guess I don't see them as diametrically opposed. And in fact, I see remarkable similarities in many cases in the process. And I think there's this really false idea that artists are creativity with no discipline, no bounds.
You have no idea how undisciplined I am, but okay.
Science is all discipline with no creativity. And okay, whether you say you're disciplined or not, I haven't been in your studio. We haven't worked together that long, but in the past, when I've worked with artists, they've laughed in my face when I've said artists are undisciplined. And I know as a writer, certainly, you know, you can't just be undisciplined. You have to sit down every day and write something, even if you hate it. Yeah. There has to be a discipline in learning the techniques of your medium. There's a discipline and a huge amount, in many cases, of research, whether it's scientific research or not, that goes into the ideation of a piece of work or body of artistic work. And all that's very similar to what's going on in science, where you're figuring out what do we already know and where are there holes, and you know, what's the next thing that we need to know. And one place that I potentially see a lot of overlap, especially with what you were just saying, and I love this framing of science, if I get it right. Science is about understanding the world we have, and art is about creating or imagining a new world. And where I think those two overlap, and this is especially true with climate science, is with the question, what if? Right? So in order to answer that question, at least from a scientific perspective, you have to understand all the nuts and bolts of the climate system to understand how it works, so that, and I'm going to mix my metaphors here, if you pull on one thread and you ask the question, what if we change this thing? What if we put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? What if we warm this part of the planet? What if we change where the water goes? What happens? Right? And so there's an immense amount of science going into trying to figure out what our future looks like in a scientific sense, what the physical processes that shape our climate look like going forward. But then you have to understand that the climate system is a physical and a biological system, but to understand, and I guess I'll say, like, you know, climate change is a physical process, but the climate crisis or the climate emergency, that's a human and a sociological phenomenon, right? And so that's where you get into the realm of to really understand and grapple with it, like you were saying, to imagine what that future not just looks like in terms of rainfall patterns and temperatures, but what does society look like when we do this to the climate? What is our daily life look like? What do our relationships with each other look like? What does our relationship with nature look like? Those aren't questions that science can really answer. And that's where we get into the realm of a huge array of artists to imagine that future. And that's always been the case, you know, with just science fiction in general. Now we have sci-fi, climate fiction, speculative fiction that's based around climate change, and a growing body of art in other media to try to understand at this more visceral human level, not just like academically, intellectually know what the future might look like, but really understand at a gut level what that means for us as people and as a society.
Wonderful. No, that's very well said. Very well said. I don't think we can top that. So Heather, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to continuing to speaking with you and continuing our relationship at Woodwell. And yeah, so thank you.
Likewise. Thrilled to have you as our artist in residence. And at some point when cups of coffee or glasses of wine or those sorts of things are a possibility again, we need to sit down and do the 3-hour version of this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Done deal. And in person too. So
Absolutely. Yes. Exactly.
As opposed to wine across Zoom. Yeah, great. Well, thank you again for all your time. And I'm Justin Brice, the artist and the artist in residence at Woodwell Climate Research Center. Yeah, thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye bye.
All right. Bye.